There's not a lot of biblical thinking today. If you look around and say, where would you go to learn how to think biblically, you certainly aren't getting it by looking at the news or reading various newspaper articles, or etc. There are plenty of people who are talking with biblical language, meaning they're using biblical terms, but there's not a lot of scriptural thinking. We're not thinking God's thoughts after Him. That is what we mean when we think about biblical thinking. We mean that we are thinking in line with God, that our thoughts are following the thoughts of God. We are thinking His thoughts after He thinks them and communicates them. To think the way that God has called us to think is what the Scriptures describe as being transformed by the renewing of our mind. It is what God speaks about in regards to the process of sanctification. It starts inward as our minds are renovated, and then leads outward to our lives being renovated. But we don't talk about much like that in regards to our lives, saying, how are you thinking? What are you thinking on this matter? In fact, we live in a day and age where that kind of language has been replaced with language like this: God spoke to me. I don't have to think about what am I to do next, how am I to operate. I just look for what God has spoken to me. He has told me this, and so I go and do it. So that even spiritual leaders use that phrase, God spoke to me, now as a means that you can't hold me accountable anymore to this, because I get to do this new will that God has given me because He has spoken to me. He is untouchable because God has spoken to him. Obviously, he must be the servant of God. But you don't gain that because you were reading through the Scriptures and you saw that that's how God communicates today. No, actually, if you're reading through the Scriptures, you see exactly what you would see in our Scripture reading this morning. Come, let us reason together. What you see in the Scriptures is Paul's statements to the Ephesians in Ephesians 4, for example, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. What you see in the Scriptures is God teaching us to be conformed to His image through sound doctrine, that which is taught to us. In fact, there's a major word group used. The word group used is nutheteo. It is the word that has the idea of putting on the mind the things that are right. We are admonished. That's the way the word is translated multiple times in the New Testament. We are admonished to think clearly. We're admonished to think properly. And it's here in Romans 9 that Paul is walking through a difficult subject matter, and he is admonishing us. He is admonishing his readers to think carefully about the gospel, and most specifically, carefully about God's work. He's admonishing Israel, rebuking them for their disobedience and rejection of the gospel. And as we listen in and as we read and as we consider what he's saying, he's also teaching us how to think carefully about sound doctrine, how to reason carefully through difficult texts. And what happens when we are taken into themes that are so grand, so marvelous, but so outside of our natural thinking? What are the temptations in our own hearts towards God and towards these various doctrines? And Paul just walks right into them. He walks right into the doctrine of election, the doctrine of predestination, the doctrine of God's sovereignty. Various doctrines themselves which many have pushed against and bristled against because it seems to be unjust or unfair, and yet Paul walks right into those doctrines and begins to lay out his teaching about them in this text.